Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the webinar on the NAEd Spencer Dissertation Fellowship Program. My name is Maria Gann. I'm the Director of Professional Development Programs at the National Academy of Education. I'm also joined by my colleague, Angie Harmon, who is the Program Officer for the Fellowship Programs, as well as McCall Kurlander, who is the current Chair of the Dissertation Fellowship Selection Committee. She is also Professor of Education Policy and Chair at the School of Education at the University of California, Davis, as well as a former fellow. But we're very excited to have you all here. Hopefully you can see our PowerPoint up on the screen. And Angie, please advance to the next slide. So here's just an overview of what we'll talk about today. I'll first provide some brief technical remarks, as well as some brief information on the fellowship, but we're really going to spend the majority of today talking about the online application. We're also going to have Dr. Kurlander provide a lot of information on what it's like to write for a broad audience and some tips on how to submit a successful application, given her very valuable perspective as a committee member and chair of the selection committee. And then finally, we want to make sure to leave plenty of time for questions. Probably about half of the webinar actually will be dedicated to Q&A, and we will be ending the webinar promptly on the hour. Next slide. So just to make sure everyone can see our PowerPoint, hopefully you can hear me fine through your computer speakers. If you do have any issues with the technical aspect of the webinar today, you can send us a message in the Q&A box that is on the bottom panel of the Zoom screen. And you can also use this box to enter questions throughout the presentation. So feel free to enter those at any point while we are speaking, and we will do our best to get to all the questions during our Q&A portion of the webinar. We are recording this webinar and we'll be posting it on our website within the next week so that you can refer back to it at a later date. Next slide. So I'll just briefly provide some information about the fellowship because we do, for the most part, these webinars are attended by people who are pretty familiar with the fellowship and are really here to learn more about the online application process and to get some advice from a selection committee member. If you have any questions about the fellowship, though, of course, you're welcome to put those into the Q&A box. And we also have a lot of great resources on our website that you can refer to after. So the Dissertation Fellowship is funded by the Spencer Foundation and administered by the organization that both Angie and I are affiliated with, which is the National Academy of Education. The fellowship is intended to be a capstone to your dissertation writing experience, and Angie will talk more in detail about what the timeline looks like for when you apply to the fellowship and how this fits within your overall dissertation writing process. But essentially, the purpose of this is to provide you with living expenses and to support the year that you are writing your dissertation. So we hope that all other pre-dissertation requirements are complete by the time the fellowship does begin. You'll see that you do receive a stipend, which is $27,500 for 1 year. But we hear often from our fellows that actually the most valuable part of the fellowship experience are the professional development opportunities that you receive. And you will attend several events, 2 of which are our professional development retreats. Those are in DC, and you will attend one in the fall and one in the spring of your fellowship period. And these are fantastic opportunities for you to get to know not only the other fellows in your cohort, but also the postdoc fellows who attend the same events, NAEd members, alumni, and other senior scholars. And it's also an opportunity for you to present your dissertation research in a collegial environment, and it gives you the chance to practice how to talk about your research with your peers and also with senior scholars. And then finally, something we're asked about quite a bit are how the funds are administered. You do have options, so you can either have them sent directly to you as an individual or to your institution. We do not have a preference for how you set this up, but I will say most dissertation fellows choose to be self-administered simply because that works best for them and for their institution. Next slide. So the application will be completed entirely online. If you go to our website, there is a dissertation fellowship page which has information about eligibility criteria, the online applications, various portions, what's expected in each section, and then it's also the links to the online application are available there as well. And once you click into the link, you'll be brought to this home page. So either you can log into an existing account, or you can create a new one. So this is what it should look like when you click into it. So I'm going to hand it off to my colleague, Angie Harmon, to talk about eligibility.
Hi, everyone. So I'm going to go over the eligibility requirements for the fellowship. Please keep them in mind when you're deciding to apply for this. Essentially, you should be ABD by the time the fellowship period begins on June 1st, 2023. You do not have to be a United States citizen, but you must be enrolled in a doctoral program at a U.S. institution of higher education. We hope by the time you submit your application, you'll have an idea of the timeline for your dissertation writing and revising, and will have completed data collection and conducted an initial analysis by the time the fellowship period begins on June 1st, 2023. And I'll go over that timeline in a little bit more detail. Note that you may be eligible to apply if you don't expect to have your data finalized by the time of your application. However, please be prepared to clearly articulate how and when your data will be collected and how this will not impede finalizing your dissertation by the end of the grant period. So I'll now go in more detail regarding the timeline for your research and how it relates to our selection process. Please note that the committees will pay careful attention to your timeline as it pertains to both pre and post-award milestones. Successful applicants often begin thinking about their application a year or more before submitting their application. As noted previously, all of your pre-dissertation requirements must be completed before the fellowship period begins in June 2023, but not necessarily before you've completed your application. You should present a reasonable plan for how you complete coursework, data collection, initial analyses, comprehensive exams, and a defense of your proposal if any of these have not concluded by the time of your application. Your post-award tasks should include, but are not limited to, writing milestones and your final dissertation defense. While the end of the fellowship does not necessarily need to coincide with your dissertation defense, they should not be significantly different. You need to hold the fellowship for a minimum of 9 months. So you should have sufficient work left to fill this timeline. If your defense will be a year or more away from the proposed end of your fellowship, you should ensure that you have a reasonable timeline for finishing your pre-award tasks. Please note that we do allow for resubmission in subsequent years if you still have sufficient time before graduation. So, and the selection process timeline. So you can see the dates here, and I'll explain what they mean. So this is just a broad overview of the selection process, including the important notifications that you're going to receive. Once the application portal closes on October 6, 2022, NAEd staff, meaning myself and Maria, will review applications for completeness and general appropriateness. Your application will then be assigned to 2 external reviewers who are not a part of our selection committee. These external reviewers will be as closely matched as possible, but perfect matches are often not possible. And so these are matches based on your discipline, methodology, and topic area. These reviews will then be sent to our full selection committee. Several members of this committee will be assigned to read your application as well as the external reviews, and then present their overview to the committee at a meeting held in February 2023. In March 2023, you'll be notified regarding whether you've become a semi-finalist, and if you do become one, you will have the opportunity to provide updates regarding your proposal, timeline, and budget. Our second selection committee meeting will occur in April 2023. And at this time, our final 35 finalists will be selected, and you'll be notified regarding your status in May 2023. And then the fellowship period begins the next month in June 2023. So if you are experiencing any difficulties with the online application or something doesn't look right, please contact us immediately. It's very important that you make sure you're applying for the correct program. There are two programs, the dissertation program and the fellowship program, and their online application portals look very similar. Once you create a login, you'll be directed to a page to choose the fellowship program. Make sure, as I said, this is a dissertation fellowship. If you're a previous applicant, you do need to start a new application and not try and resubmit a previous one, as it will not be assessed. The application due date is October 6, 2022 at 5:00 p.m. Eastern Time. This is a hard date and time. No applications will be accepted after the deadline, and no edits or additions to your applications will be made on your behalf by NAEd staff. And I do want to add a note that your references have the same deadline that you do. And this is a little bit unusual for other programs that you may have applied for, or when you applied for graduate school, where often your references can submit after you submit your application. That's not the case here. So please ensure your reference writers are aware that they too have the deadline of October 6, 2022 at 5 p.m. All right. And so, right. Sorry. Previous. Okay. So, two pieces of advice. Please plan to submit your application early and do not call the NAEd office on the due date. We often receive an enormous amount of phone calls and emails at that time, and it's difficult for us to get to everyone, although we will make an attempt. So do contact us if you have any issues. If you have issues on the due date, please know we will try to work with you, but as I said, it can be really difficult to get to everyone. All right. So with that, I will hand this over to McCall. McCall?
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. McCall Kurlander, and I'm happy to be with you here today, and already want to congratulate you for attending the webinar, which will, I think, hopefully really help you in the month you have to prepare this application. Also just want to note that it's great that you're doing this, because these kinds of applications will be useful for other types of fellowships and awards you might do through your university or elsewhere. And so the advice we're about to give you, I think, will be useful for many types of fellowship applications. So the first is about the audience. And so again, this is a fellowship devoted to work on education. And so that means we're going to have a lot of folks from the field of education, which is a multidisciplinary field. We also have folks within disciplines doing work in education. You want to think of your audience as folks who know quite a bit about education, but who may not know the nuances of your specific disciplinary perspective. And so you do want to write for a largely general academic education audience, right? Lots of disciplines are represented on the selection committee. We really cover the wide range of social sciences and humanities that focus on education, and including folks who are deeply in teaching and in education. And as Angie already mentioned, the initial readers, we really try to match with your specific disciplinary perspective, even methodological perspective, as best we can. And so the committee as a whole has expertise, as do the first reviewers, across methodological and analytic approaches that you might be working in. But you also do want to try as much as possible to avoid jargon. Angie described the semifinalist list. At that point, it actually is read by a very large portion of the overall committee. And so that means, although I am not a historian, I read historical applications that are from history of education, qualitative, quantitative work. And so you do want to make sure that your work could be understood by a general academic audience, and that you, as a result, try to avoid jargon. And then I'll say more about that as we get to the specific components. We can go ahead and advance the slide. So what does your audience need to know? What does the selection committee, including those initial reviewers, need to know? We kind of have these as 3 components, and I'm going to say a bit more about each one. But first, the importance of your research, right? So this is a really important fellowship for the National Academy because it's really recognizing new work in the field. And so we really want to know, why is this new work important to our field? We care about the quality and the feasibility of the project. Are they able to do this work? And what's the rigor, the academic, the methodological rigor of the work? And then we want to, this is also about you as a promising researcher. And so we want to know, how will you and your work, both the dissertation, though that's not the sum total of who you will be as an academic or as a researcher, what will you contribute to education research in the future? And so we have lots of sources of information. The biggest one I saw we already had a question about, that will be your project description, but we do have the application includes letters of recommendation, your career goals and personal statement, and those also play an important role in communicating the information on those 3 components. So let me delve a little deeper into each of those 3 components. We can go ahead and advance. Whoops. Back one. Yeah, there we go. Importance of the research. So what's at stake here? How will our understanding differ based on the outcomes of your research? And so one of the biggest pieces of advice is, don't let us do that guessing work, right? And so one of the best things you can do in your application is tell us this work is innovative, is new, or will change how we think about X, Y, or Z for these reasons, right? And so you tell us in your application why the work is so important, how it advances the field, how it builds on prior research, or how it does something new and original, right? So what, as part of that, it's also the impact that you think this will have on the field. And that impact could be methodological, could be conceptual or theoretical, and it could be specific to practice tomorrow, to improving a classroom or an education space, right? And so the biggest thing to do is to not, your work is important. Don't let us guess that based on what you write. Tell us why the work is important, and be as explicit. Even if it sounds funny to say, like, this is the 3 ways in which my work advances prior work on, again, peer effects, whatever topic you're focused on. And so don't be shy about claiming why the work is novel, important, and new. The second thing is the quality of the research. And here I would say folks sometimes make the mistake of devoting too little of the overall word count to methodology. And I want to just encourage you to make sure that yes, you need to contextualize the work, you need to say why it's important, you need to summarize the literature it's connected to, but you also want to make sure that you leave significant space in your narrative to describe your overall research design and why it's appropriate to answer the question that you posed. And so as much specifics as you can, given the very tight word limit. And I will say something about appendices and how they can be helpful to you, but you do want to, again, provide the specifics that a general academic could decipher as being enough information to tell us that the work is reasonably laid out, feasible to do, and that the main research questions that you posed can be answered with your suggested data collection strategy. If there are important limitations, again, raise them. We know this work builds on itself, it's not perfect. And so we want to make sure, again, don't let us find the fatal flaw. And hopefully there isn't a fatal flaw, but there will be flaws because all research has some. And so please, if it's in a limitation section, you can do that. If it's through some sparingly, but footnotes or other things, again, I think those caveats are better for you to put out than for us to kind of discuss and find on our own. So if there are limitations, make sure you raise them. Now, the quality of the applicant is that third component here. Really, again, we're really looking for the work. The project still will be, I think, the primary indicator on showing promise of the kind of research that we expect from this person, but also more broadly, your personal statement, what your letters of recommendation say about your prior experience, your future goals, your motivation to do certain kinds of work is really important. And so again, we're looking for folks who have a long-term trajectory to contribute to education research in the long run, again, with your dissertation just being one piece of that longer path in your academic career. Okay, we can advance. So some special hints. I think Angie already did a great job with the timeline. It really is studied in detail. We do a lot of guesswork around, we don't want to do a lot of guesswork around how close is this person to finishing. So there is a sort of sweet spot of when it's good to get this award. It really is in that last year. We know things happen. We've been experiencing that for the last several years. So we very much understand the timelines don't always work the way you intended. And for some of you who are not sure if this is the right timeline for you, I still would encourage you to use this month and write this proposal, because that will help you even if you decide to submit next year, or even if you resubmit next year. And so creating a timeline and a plan is still really important. So it is this sort of not too early and not too late, because we do want to see that you're beyond just the conceptualization. You have crossed more of those milestones. In some cases, especially with a lot of intense qualitative data or historical data, we're looking for projects where the data has actually already been collected and you really are at the analysis and writing stage. That looks different, I recognize, for different disciplines and fields, but in general, think of it as the timeline for kind of your last year of your doctoral studies. At the same time, we don't want it to be a postdoc. We have those too. And so we want to make sure you're not done, so done with the project, that you still have important work to do and revisions or, in some cases, there's still some data work. I want to say a word about multi-paper dissertations, which largely come from our quantitative applicants, either in economics or sociology or education policy. And I want to say we award these every year. And so when we say the committee struggles with these, it doesn't mean we don't accept them. We do. We understand that's the field. A lot of my own students do that. I did that myself. But we just want to make sure that you treat it carefully. And here's what I mean. You do not have enough space, word limit, to describe all three papers. That's just so. The first piece of advice is do not tell us in detail about all three projects. You are able to tell us about all three to a small extent, but you really want to devote enough attention to at least one so that we really understand all of those things on that prior slide, the significance, the importance of the work, for at least to go deeply in one paper. Sometimes there are companion papers, and so you could do it on two papers. So I can't give you kind of an overall rule, but I can tell you that we need the detail. And so often, if people describe all three papers, we just don't have enough information on any one paper to get what we need about the significance of the work or the research design. So we do recommend focusing on your job market paper, your main paper, and if you want to devote another paragraph to say how it's going to be complemented with other studies, that is fine. Sometimes we have the letter writers end up describing some of those other studies in their letter of recommendation. And so we do end up learning about the other papers in a multi-paper dissertation. Happy to answer additional questions about that if that comes up at the end. This is one of the biggest pieces of advice when you have such a selective kind of fellowship, which is that writing counts for a lot. And that means get feedback from your peers. If you don't go to your advisor for that kind of feedback, which I know a lot of folks don't, share it with a peer or a colleague, make sure the writing is clean and as proofed as possible. It's one of the easiest ways to remove an applicant is if they just didn't take care in the writing. And so just can't stress it enough that writing counts for a lot. Looking for a coherent narrative and something that makes sense to the general academic audience. A final really important piece that's already come up on your letter writers. It's a strong letter, when possible, includes information about your project, not just about you and they were my TA and they're friendly and they're wonderful and they have great promise. There's much specificity about the project that you're engaged in and why your advisor believes it will advance the field carries a lot of weight. So that means it's about a month away, a little less than a month away that this is due. That means that if you haven't shared a proposal, if you haven't described your project with your advisor, it's really important that you do that soon. And when you send them a reminder of that due date, that you remind them which project or what your dissertation, if they don't remember, is that you're gonna propose, and that they are able to speak to it. And that means probably giving them a draft of your proposal if you haven't already. It's also okay to give your advisor and other letter writers other points that you hope they make in their letter of recommendation. I appreciate that when my students do that for me. They might choose letter writers because they cover different things. Maybe when someone's coming to me because they TA'd my stats class and their project is qualitative, but they want me to speak to the fact that they're actually able to do mixed methods work, or they're able to teach well, depending on the fellowship. And so it's okay to give a little tip to your letter writers about what you want them to cover in the letter, to make sure that, again, you're able to kind of know that your letters, in addition to your application forms, cover the full range of the information that you hope we get about you as an applicant and about your project. Okay, so appendices. The selection committee, the application does not require appendices, nor are we required to read the appendices. And so what does that mean? So it means you should be judicious in including them. Assume that it's the narrative that we are focused on, and that includes all the critical information. But for many folks, for a variety of reasons, the appendices would add really useful supporting information to show an instrument that's been in the field, like a survey instrument, or basic descriptive stats that show that you have, the power analysis for an experiment, or that you've obtained the data, or additional space to discuss kind of a complicated equation that you don't want to take up, a whole page to do in the narrative. So think about it judiciously. If you think that the committee really it would be helpful for them to see the additional information, then include it, but don't write your narrative assuming they will look at it. So that is why it's tricky. So I think you can always err on the side of including them if you think it's useful, but just make sure you're not too dependent on them. For example, see research design in the appendix. That would not fly, right? So you want to make sure you describe your research design. If there are nuances to the data collection or the instrumentation, or a pilot that you want to reference that you've done to show proof of concept or something that you want to put in the appendix, that would make more sense. Again, happy to answer additional questions as much as I can. Generally, if not, definitely asking your advisor would make a lot of sense. Okay, I think that's it. I think you probably all have some questions. I'll turn to them and have Angie and Maria direct me to any that I should answer.
All right. Yes, thank you all. We're taking your questions now. I see Maria has already begun answering some of them. So let's take a look here.
I wanted to, I was typing in answers for some of them, but I just want to verbally make a couple points because I think some of these questions are ones we get quite often. You should be able to see my answers, the text answers I wrote in, but I just want to clarify a couple things. So something that Angie did say, but I want to emphasize again is, yes, your letters of reference are due by the deadline. Please make sure that you have let your reference writers know now that when the deadline is, and that you enter their names and emails in the application if you haven't done that yet, because that will send them the email that has the instructions for how to submit their letter and what we're looking for in the letter. So it's always good to have them aware of it sooner rather than later. We also had some questions about how the fellowship funds can be used, and we really are quite flexible in how you use the funding. I would say generally most people use it to cover living expenses. So that can be anything from rent to childcare. It's really up to you. You do not need to use your stipend to cover travel to the retreats that we require you to attend. We will cover those separately. So your stipend really is meant to just support you during the fellowship writing, the dissertation writing phase, and with the ultimate goal that you don't have to, hopefully you don't have to work while you are focusing on your dissertation.
So there's a question here that was, somebody is an ABD student, you plan to graduate in summer 2023, and whether you are eligible to apply for the fellowship. So as I said before, you have to hold the fellowship for a minimum of 9 months. If it doesn't sound like this timeline will work for you, as you'll graduate at the time the fellowship period begins in June 2023. So I encourage you to begin looking at the postdoctoral fellowship, which is a separate program. You do have 1 year between the time that you graduate and the time that you start becoming eligible to apply for the postdoctoral fellowship, but you are eligible for 5 years after that.
We had some questions from people who are not within the field, directly within the field of education, or aren't with the Department of Education, wondering if they're eligible. Certainly, and in fact, I think one of the strongest components of this fellowship program is that it is interdisciplinary. And so we want applicants from all disciplines, all methodological perspectives, so long as your proposal is focused on education, and we define that very broadly, and that you can show in your application that you're planning to build a career in education research. So this should not just be a one-off education research project, but really should show how fellowship is going to help launch your career. So I think it's just important to try to weave that throughout your application. For instance, someone was asking specifically, can my 2 letters of reference be from people within my discipline rather than within the field of education? That's fine, but really they do need to be aware of the fact that, education research is the focus of this fellowship. And so I would make sure that they're very clear on the parameters of the fellowship and its, the mission of the program, so that they do weave that into their letter. McCall, did you want to add to that at all?
Yeah, I think I would just echo what you said and say, I don't know, I don't remember the stats offhand, but I think it's high, like a third to half of come from disciplines that focus on education, but not education directly. So we do encourage, we love folks who are coming directly from disciplines and that have a potential connection. And I think as much as I can reinforce what Maria said, we do want to make sure that the dissertation is not a one-off focus on education, that the sustained work, whether you're a historian, economist, sociologist, will be, as much as we can do that, that guesswork is that your broad work is going to be, your disciplinary work is interested in education kind of career-wise. I know there are others. Should I just take some others? I think I answered, I think the 3 paper came before I spoke, so I hope I answered it. If not, feel free to type another question. Again, try as much as you can to focus on giving us as much detail in one. The weight of different aspects, I think I said that we don't weight them that way. We review as a holistic application. I would say to the extent that the thing that matters most, it is the narrative of the project. But we do take that in consultation with broader questions around who you are, what you bring to the cohort. This is something that maybe we didn't say, which is it's this mentoring and this it is a cohort experience. I benefited from it many years ago, but it's, part of the beauty is that you're bringing people from across disciplines, all focused on education in very different ways, different methodological approaches. And so we are looking for diversity in every possible way of thinking and of approach of institutions. And so I think that ends up being part of the selection too, in that we want to make sure we're getting the broadest kind of thinking and approaches to problems of education.
I want to add on a little bit to something that McCall said here, talking about diversity. So the NAEd is strongly invested in the diversity of our fellowship cohorts, and we think about that along many lines, including, disciplinary methodology, race, ethnicity, geographic location, institution, basically any form of diversity that we're looking for is really important. So if you see something, if you're looking through our previous fellows and you see that you're not represented there, and your field isn't represented, your topic area, your methodology, or your institution isn't represented there, that's important, that you should consider applying and adding to the diversity of future cohorts. It's certainly not a negative, and it is definitely a positive in many cases if you're able to add a new and fresh perspective.
And there are a couple of questions I think that others might have. I think they're great. So one is just that anonymizing the setting for reviewers. This does come up sometimes. So I just want to make sure you should use the same guidelines. Not that we ever distribute any of these, but you should use the same guidelines you might use for any of your writing, and whether you're revealing your sites or subjects. But it can be, settings can often be a really important way for you to explain why the work is important. And so even if you choose to keep it anonymous for a variety of methodological kind of agreement reasons, you may describe the setting to us in a way that reminds us why the work is important. In other words, depending on whether you plan to reveal that in your published works or not. I hope that helps. Again, your advisor could also in their letter just describe some of that. Got a question on whether the other 2 papers in a 3-paper dissertation could be described in the appendix. I think that's an interesting question. And what I would say here again is what's nice about that is that you can say something about the other 2 without taking up space. You want to not assume folks will read that. And so keep that in mind. But it does, and we don't want another 20 pages on each of those papers that I can guarantee no one will read. But if it's helpful to put the abstract or an extended abstract in the appendix so that all, because you feel like you need to, explain the overall dissertation, that is useful. Some people, again, devote a paragraph and then you could reference an appendix. That's something you can do. It ends up being helpful often in discussions if folks are sort of like, oh, this seems like such a narrow, a narrow question, a narrow piece. And then if we have reference to the other papers, then we can sort of say, oh, but it seems to be part of a larger set of papers on economics of education that focus on using these data or on different related questions. And so again, I would not write a whole extended set of narrative on the other two papers, but I think beyond referencing them in a page or two in the appendix is not a bad idea.
So we've had a few questions about the start date for fellowships. So you can start as early as June 1st, 2023, or as late as January 1st, 2024. We don't have a preference. You don't need to justify why you would want to start at a particular time. You would just, I'm the person who handles that, so you would just email me, should you be selected, and tell me what you prefer as a start date.
There's a question here about previously conducted works, and I'm not sure if they mean your own previously conducted work or more generally. So I'm going to answer from both. I think definitely important, the committee, by the nature of being on the committee, I've been in the field for a while. And so making sure that you are well-grounded in the work that you're expanding on is really important. So we do care. It doesn't have to mean, we're not looking for you. We know the space constraints, so we're not looking for you to eat the library and write a whole lit review, a massive lit review in the narrative, but we are looking to make sure you know what work you're building from. And so that means you do want to do your homework on making sure you kind of dot the I's and cross the T's on folks in that space that, maybe that are the usual suspects in that field that you want to make sure that you are referencing and building from and saying how the work extends prior knowledge. If this is extending your prior work, because you've been at this for a while, I think we are definitely looking at kind of professional trajectory. And if you're building off your master's thesis or you're in a lab and you're building off prior work, using the personal narrative for that or some reference in your narrative, in your main project narrative, personal statement or your main project narrative to say, this work for my dissertation builds on, prior work I did in this space, I think is also really useful.
So we've had a few questions about work, whether you're able to work a full-time job, whether you're able to work as a GA or a TA while you're holding this fellowship. So you are allowed to work 10 to 15 hours per week maximum while you hold this fellowship. So this wouldn't be compatible with having a full-time job, but this is compatible often with certain types of GA and TA positions where you might only work just a few hours or teach one course. What you'll do is that you'll make sure to contact NAEd staff to describe what, the number of hours you plan to work per week. And we will be able to approve if it's 10 to 15 or fewer.
Should I take a couple of them again? So that are,
Yes.
Yeah, Maria, do you want to go for it?
I was actually going to see if you would talk about the people often ask about those the short answer questions, which I think sometimes can trip folks up because a lot of the time you do sort of repeat yourself a little bit throughout the application. So could you talk about how the reviewers use those answers to help inform their decision making?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's helpful for, because we review so many, it's a helpful shorthand. Oh, this is a project that's focused on this. But if it's not perfectly worded, we definitely, we need all those words in the narrative to understand your full project. So yes, I agree, Mary, sometimes you just have this perfect 3 sentences and you just might want to use them and that's okay. And we know 100 words is less, but it is helpful for us to be like, this is this is like math instruction, and like this is something that tells us, I think, again, as much as you can not use those precious 100 words to tell us what we knew before, but like, you know, this project advances our thinking in math education in 3 ways or something like that. I think it ends up being really useful, but it is hard. And it's definitely something that I think that's a good non-jargony exercise that sharing with your peer who's in a totally different field is also really useful. Make sure they understand every word in those 100 words and that they, and that it makes sense to a general audience. Dare I say that's even the 100 words you should share with someone not an academic in your field who can follow that, a family member perhaps. So I think don't let them trip you up too much. We know that it takes a little bit of time to, you know, we're mostly focused on the narrative, but it is a good shorthand for us. And it is repetitive often with aspects in the abstract.
Carl, somebody asked how to handle in particular the prompt about most scholars now believe, and they're not sure how to respond to this question or what it's trying to get at from the applicant.
Yeah, I think what we are, you know, it's basically the reason I'm on this committee is I just really get excited by new researchers and new ways of thinking. And so that is the goal of this whole fellowship is, you know, is I learn constantly from my students all the time. So it's really like, you know, how are you advancing our thinking about, you know, again, in your area of research? So it really is, this one does actually ask you to say, we've thought about the context of community and school relationships in this way for the last, you know, this many years, or communities matter to schools because of the following reasons. You know, what we haven't understood is how school-based health centers, I don't know, I'm just really throwing something out, you know, play an important role, or how familial ties to education or whatever. So I think you want to sort of say what your work is grounded in, like what general area are you in, historically or you know, in a contemporary sense or a theoretical sense, like, you know, we've known that social capital matters for building educational advancement. What we haven't learned is how this intersects differently for students from different communities, something like that. My project advances this work in the following way. So it really is a way to, you know, where you've been reading, what's your main area, is kind of the first couple sentences. And then how you're advancing that work, asking a new question, a new setting, a new data, new approach is what follows. Let me see. I felt like there were others. Does it matter for, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, McCall, no, you go ahead with the one you just found.
I think I lost it, sorry. To be related to the project. I think some people have asked a lot about who the right letter writer. Again, it's okay if your letter writer is within your very narrow discipline. Again, if you can give them that tip on like why education, so it's not just you telling us that you're in, you know, philosophy and you're writing a piece and it's about education, but having your advisor say they're invested in kind of thinking about philosophy of education, something like that would be important that we hear from them as well as from you. Methodology, length of methodology. So 4 pages of methodology, remind me the overall word limit depending on, it's like we're looking at 10 pages of narrative doublespace, is that right? Do I have that right, Angie? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so someone who's saying here, I have about 4 pages. Again, I don't know what your project is or what the methodology is, but I think that sounds like a decent ratio to me. You know, I don't want you to, you know, hold me to it. So I don't want to say like 2 is too little and 8 is too much, but I think you want to think about a third, I would say, of your overall narrative, you know, at least a quarter, but they're to like how you're going to pull this off, what the design is really important.
Someone was asking if they need to be explicit in the application about why this particular fellowship would benefit them. They were, you know, specifically the mentoring piece of the fellowship.
Yeah.
So that would be interesting to hear your perspective on that.
So I think I answered that when I thought, maybe I didn't, maybe
I'm sorry, you probably
no, it's okay. No,
yeah.
it's good. Maybe it means we should answer it publicly. So I think I would personally, and please, Angie and Maria, feel free to, you've seen this, I would put that in the personal statement. I don't think you should use valuable word count words in the project narrative to put that in there. I think we know you're doing the work to apply that you would benefit. We think you would benefit. We think a lot of people would benefit from the mentoring and the fellowship experience. But if, especially for folks maybe not directly in education and why this is so useful, I think the personal statement ends up being really particularly important, especially for those coming from disciplines that are kind of adjacent to education or related, but not directly.
Yeah, that sounds good. I do think it's better to not just assume that the reviewers will know why you're applying. And you don't have to take up a lot of space in the personal statement, but to make some kind of connection to your career and your long-term goals and why this fellowship particularly would be beneficial, I think is always a useful exercise for our reviewers to see that.
Yeah. A couple others that I think would benefit from just answering live is this time span and like the ethnographic field work that happened pre-pandemic and then writing and happening after. We had a lot of this in the last couple of years. We understand it's, people had to change their whole design, move to remote, any number of things. I think, again, don't let us guess what some of the challenges of that are. I think devoting some narrative to the complexity of the ethnographic fieldwork happening pre-pandemic, the analysis happening now, not just the analysis, but other things that may have changed in the space where you did the ethnographic work. We understand we do not, fault you for a global pandemic happening, but having you think through, which you probably already have as you write this up, how it implicates how you interpret your findings, how you think about it today, post-pandemic, is useful. So again, don't pretend it didn't happen. That's actually one of the worst mistakes you can make, to the extent that for many of you, the last several years impacted something about your research design or your trajectory in any way. If you think it's in a way that is consequential to what you're proposing, then state that. I think that is much more helpful for us to know than for us to sort of say, how are they not mentioning the pandemic? That must have impacted how they are doing this data collection, right? So, and that has happened in our, Angie and Maria saw it. And I think that person just thought, oh, maybe if I don't mention it, well, we won't think about it, but we've all experienced this. And when it's obvious it would have implicated the setting or the stage then where you're doing your work or why it's taken longer, it's much better to just state it.
We've had a couple questions about how methodological diversity is handled on the committee. So if someone, for instance, is submitting a very heavily quantitative statistical analysis project, how do they write so that people coming from different methodological perspectives can understand and appreciate the importance of those methods, while maybe not having the technical jargon to fully understand them?
It's such a good question, and let me do the best I can. So we do have, quite a lot of methodological expertise on the committee. And again, as Angie's already mentioned, we try to make sure you're first, if you're writing, for example, if you're coming from statistics or economics, we try as much as we can to make sure that first read is also by someone in your field. So rest assured that someone who does, so don't dumb it down for anyone in any way, right? We do want to, people in your field will be able to at some point read it, but you also want to make sure that folks who don't necessarily know the specific kind of approach are able to make sense of it. And so there are different ways people do it. I would err on the side of, some equations, but not all equations. You don't want to write this as like, just a series of equations. If some might be best in an appendix. You also want to make sure that the equation's already there with the terms and their interpretations, but you want to make sure that there is a word version that goes with that equation that anyone should be able to understand, right? This model is aiming to try to understand that, to explain differences in, X, Y, or Z and how they might be attributed to campus difference, whatever it is. And I say that as a person who tries to do that in my own practice. And so no complicated kind of econometric equation couldn't be explained in words. And you need to work on that. If it's not happening to you naturally, then using some of your peers or advisors to make sure that you're able to explain it in words. So again, feel free to put a couple equations. I wouldn't, in the 10-page narrative, I probably wouldn't put more than max 3 or 4, because you just don't have space to explain them. And even that's a lot. I think the strong quantitative ones that are able to get through kind of explain it in 1 and 2 equations, would you say, Angie and Maria, and then maybe put more in an appendix. So that's probably what I would guide you on as best I can. Sometimes our quant folks use footnotes a little bit more. That's another strategy where the terms or something are, they use more space in the footnotes. But you do want to make sure that anyone can read it. So don't assume that you can, read it, that only the quantitative folks will get it, but then also assume the quantitative folks will scrutinize it in a way that makes sure that that you have what you need, that you've explained your methods well enough that it holds up.
Someone was asking, oh, sorry, Angie, go ahead.
There was a question I wanted to answer relatively quickly, and that was about other funding. If you receive another type of dissertation fellowship reward. So you are not able to hold this fellowship in conjunction with an additional external fellowship or a grant or award. Some kinds of internal institutional funding is eligible. Like you may accept that concurrently, but it's important that you check with us first should you be awarded a fellowship.
I saw a couple questions about how to highlight your past publications and presentations and make it clear that you are well qualified to carry out the work that you're proposing. Someone asked specifically, should we dedicate any of our personal statements to talking about this, or should we really rely on the short answer question that asked specifically about publications and presentations? I'm going to actually briefly answer and then let McCall speak more on this, but I would say really your goal is to weave that throughout your application. So the reviewers are going to learn about your experience in your letters of reference. Those are really people who know you and your work well. They'll talk about how you're qualified to carry out the work, what you've done so far in the field. I wouldn't dedicate too much space in the personal statement to describing specifically why you're well qualified to carry out this project, because I do think it's evident throughout your application. But you certainly can briefly mention that and then really focus on, I think, more what it is about this particular project. What are you drawn to about this particular project? Where do you see your career going? So more, in a broad lens. But McCall, I want to make sure you agree with that. And
I do. Yeah, I really echo everything Maria said. And I think there's someone even asked like how to phrase them chronologically or in groups. I don't think we ask you specifically. So either, unless we ask you, please put these in chronologically. I think you can, but you can also put them in presentations and publications. But yeah, I think we do often, as we answer that third kind of component of what the scholar brings, the emerging scholar brings to the cohort, we look at the whole package, and that includes that you've been out, publishing or at conferences. And again, this is a tip you can give some of your letter writers. You have 2 letter writers, and so maybe one of them just, who knows you in different capacities can also reference your broader work, or that they've already been in, multiple labs or projects or whatever. So I think that I'm just echoing what Maria said, we use all of that information. Also, just don't want to shot. It is for dissertation work, and different fields have different experience. So this part of our conversation is stressing some of you out are like, I don't have any publications and I've never, you shouldn't. We give plenty of awards to folks who haven't published yet. This may be their first publication, but we also, have folks from different disciplines and different fields and have been involved in labs and other things. And so don't be shy about applying if you haven't had a publication. We understand that varies tremendously by field and sometimes by institution.
McCall, I apologize if you answered this one, but I've seen a few questions about preliminary findings and how to incorporate those.
I actually meant to say that. Yeah. So we see some of that sometimes. I think if it makes sense to show how advanced you are in your project, then doing that is a good idea, showing preliminary findings to make sure that we know that you actually started the analysis work. I think that's fine. Again, too many that sound less preliminary kind of can hit on what Angie's talking about, which is, do they really need this? Are they basically done? And so you do want to balance that a little bit, but I think showing that you've already, for the quantitative dissertations that, that the data hold up, like that you're able to do the work, for the qualitative that you've started analysis and, you're sitting on a lot of data. I mean, both cases can be really helpful.
Angie, go ahead.
Oh, no, we just had a brief question that was, somebody was asking about whether the selection committee will consider applicants who went back to school to pursue further research and teaching interests. And we have quite a few fellows who have done this. The age of applicants is not considered. It does add to the diversity of the cohort. But often, having experience outside of the dissertation can really be a strength and something that you might approach in your personal statement.
We've had several people asking about international settings versus US. So just from a practical standpoint, you do need to be a student at a US institution, but you don't need to be living within the US during the fellowship period. We have people living abroad. That's perfectly fine as long as you are based at a US institution. You also don't need to be a US citizen. But then the other piece of this question is whether your research can be focused on non-US settings, and absolutely it can. And that's an important piece of our diversity priority, which is that we want people who are looking beyond the United States setting. So certainly that is, you're eligible, and also it's a priority for us to include in the cohort scholars looking at international settings as well.
There's a question here about reapplication, and this person is asking whether a prior rejection or a timeline change would give a negative impression to the selection committee. The selection committee is not going to treat you any differently if you resubmit an application in a subsequent year, and having been rejected does not impact your application negatively.
I think I answered a few directly. There was one around timing. Did you see that one, Angie? Like October, maybe we already talked about that. Can they start in October?
Oh, I haven't seen that one, but yes, you may start in October if that is what works best for you.
I think we answered the question about balanced cohort. I'm not sure what you mean by balanced, but we do look for every kind of possible diversity to create the most rich cohort experience for the finalists.
Mm-hmm.
What's good and what's not good in the appendices. I just answered one about a figure that someone said is critical to their narrative. If it's critical, that is, we couldn't fully appreciate what you're doing without it, then it should be in the narrative, because we can't assume folks will look at the appendix. Otherwise, figures and tables often. I think, again, appendices that I think have been most successful is additional information on quantitative methodology that is more technical in nature, or that shows kind of first stage related data analysis that is helpful for us to be convinced that the work is possible and that the data are there. Others are instruments for data collection, interviews or surveys that are, again, show that the actual data collection procedures. Other kinds of tables that kind of show types of data collected and things like that. So I think methodology, as I'm listening to myself speak, I'm realizing that is probably the thing that's most useful to use the appendices for, is further articulating for detailing information about your methodology, data sources, data analysis, things like that is helpful to include in an appendix. Again, assuming the narrative holds up without it.
McCall, I have another question for you that I think is interesting. Someone is asking, what are the common mistakes people make in personal statements, things that should have been included or elaborated on that they didn't, or too much detail on other items? Could you give your thoughts about that?
Sure. And I'm going to answer for personal statement, but they might be asking for more generally the full narrative. I mean, I think people use a personal statement actually quite differently, I've noticed. Some people it's like a narrative of their CV, and others are like a more passionate kind of story of their life, or like a short story of, or what motivated them to do this project. I don't know if, I think as much information that you can offer, if there's a really compelling aspect to who you are as a researcher that and why you arrived at this moment to study this topic, that's how I would use the personal statement, what has brought you here. And as much as you can offer trajectory in that statement, what you plan to bring to the field and why the work is important to you, why you think it would advance our understanding of the problem you're working in education, that's how I would use the personal statement. Some of that I actually would do in the main narrative as well. So I don't think I've seen any like truly, the only flaw I've ever seen in a personal statement is that they just didn't use the space well enough, because actually it's just a narrative of the questions we asked you to, fill in, like when your degree dates and, where you studied and what time span and things like that. So again, use that to what we've all been saying as additional source of information for us to learn something about you in the personal statement that isn't already articulated by the short answer questions or the fields where you indicate your prior education and things like that. Maybe professional activity, work you did, that led you to this point. And in the narrative, it's tough. I mean, again, first, let me just say we have way more excellent applicants than we ever could give, right? So, so I think that's just important to know that it's not always because the proposals are weak. We just have too many excellent proposals to fund. So I think we, well, I'll stop there because I know we're out of time as well.
All right. So yes, we are at 3 p.m. Eastern. I want to thank you all for joining us, and especially thanks to Mikal and Maria for your insight and help. If you have a question that we were not able to get to at the, by the end of this, remember you can contact me or Maria for help, and we'll be happy to answer your questions. My email is aharmon, AHARMON, @naeducation.org. And I look forward to seeing your applications and hearing from you.
Thank you all so much.